almost have enough lacing now to finish the lacing the gunnels, and I've still got a lot more root to process because I've got to do both the bow and the stern. That's going to take a lot of root. But yeah, I've got enough now finished, processed, and ready to go. When I initially laid the bark out, I mentioned I had a bad spot. Well, it couldn't have worked out any better. So luck of the Irish was with me. So that was the spot, and it extended way up here. So, and there's 64 lashings on this canoe. And so lashing rib. So I'm going to have a lashing either side of that bad spot. So it's almost like I planned it, but I didn't. Anyway, I thought I'd demonstrate one lashing, not 64. That would be rather tedious. So from start to finish, and yeah, I've got this, I'm about a quarter done now. So I've got 1/4 of the canoe done. And when I say 64 lashings, there's a number of lashings that will take place in the bow once I get putting the stem piece in. And I might demonstrate that too. So that is sort of what the bow and stern of the canoe is going to look like. Somewhat like that. Anyway, to a lacing. So the first thing I do is I take my knife and I take the widest part of the lacing and I put a small flat spot on it. And then I take my wooden pegs that I've driven in and I drive them back out. First you build it, that loosens up the gunnel. And then where my lashing goes, insert my knife and I spread apart the gunnel from the bark. So when I get it spread out enough that I can insert the root, that's perfect. Next step is to nail it back again. So once I've driven that back in, I've got that anchored pretty good. And the next step is to cut off the wooden pegs. So all the wooden pegs on the side of the canoe are going to get hidden by the lashing. Point out too that, so when we split it, if we get a close look here, we've got a flat side and we got a bottom side. So the rounded side is always going to be on the outside of the canoe, and the flat side goes against my inner and outer gunnels. So I get a nice tight fit. That's why we split them. That's why we don't use them round, and it gives us a nice strong lash. So at this point, I'm going to put a little point on the end of my sewing thread, for lack of a better word. One that's stiff enough and thin enough that it's going to go through the small holes that I'm going to make. I got a lot of noisy birds. Every bird box we built and put up back here, we got over 70 in the woodlot, but most of them have tenants in them, and that's why we number them, so we can see who's renting our houses out for the season. But I got some noisy ones over here. We talk about animals not being able to reason. So when I was sewing earlier today, I noticed both the male and the female are feeding the fledglings at this point. And when they come into the nest, they're bringing food. Well, at one point, one was perched by the hole and feeding. The other one came in with a mouthful. Well, there isn't room for 2 adult heads in the hole. So they stood there and looked at each other for a minute, and one passed the food, worm or bug or some sort, to the other one, and the other one fed the birds. So yeah, when they say animals can't reason, I just don't buy it. Approximately 3 holes, depending on the width of the root, but this one will take 3 holes that I will, with my triangular awl. Again, I'm not removing fiber, I'm just kind of pushing it aside. And once the root dries out, it's just like it's nailed or screwed together. So in through the hole, flat side against the bark. I'm going to go 3 times through. The first one kind of really locks that guy in. And we get that nice and flat, and we pull the first one through. Now at this point, if I have to awl again in that same hole, I don't. It's fairly small. I'll use the round awl. That way I don't cut the previous thread. So that's my second pass through. Round awl to just enlarge that just enough to get the lace through. So that's my third pass through. Then triangular awl, second hole. I'm trying to keep that up as tight both to the inner and the outer gunnel to the bottom as possible so I don't rip out my bark. On this side, the bark's pretty thick. You can see the thickness of it through here, but on the other side, it's a bit thinner, the side panel I used. So I'm going to have to put doubling bark there. Otherwise, my bark's going to split down the lenticels, the vertical lines you see. And that's going to weaken that side. So I'm going to put a piece of bark that you won't see on the inside of the canoe when it comes to the other side. It amazes me how strong root is. Occasionally, when I'm pulling on it hard, it breaks, and then one simply starts again. Third hole. Now on the inside, I'm going to lock it off with the last two wraps. So I got to go through this hole twice. So what I'm going to do is not tighten this down this time. I'm going to leave a little slack here. I'm going to do that. I'm going to do that. So there's the tail end of the thing. So I'm going to pass it back through the previous two loops. And it's going to get hidden down underneath here when I'm all said and done. You won't see this, and that tail will get cut off. Then I go back to finding my first one, which is this guy, and working it back. And that's one of the two loops. And that one's finished. And we cut off the tail. And we have one more lashing done, and I don't know, 50 some to go. Well, maybe not quite 50. It's coming along. I am removing the last rock, and I finished all the lacing. So yeah, it was a wee bit of work, but it's done, and it's starting to really look like a canoe now. So I'm going to try to get out my my building frame off the bottom. Hopefully it's going to go out through the bow here, or the stern, and we are on to the tricky part. Okay, that's not going to go out so handy. We'll try this piece first. This is pretty neat because since I started the build, this hasn't been movable, and now that I can move it about and start working on my end pieces, it's one step closer to floating. So I mentioned when I first started constructing the thwarts that I used measuring sticks. So it's really flat bottomed now, and once the ribs are driven in, it's going to be much deeper here. So an average canoe is 12 to 13 inches. So I've got about 9 inches here to here. And when I'm finished driving the ribs in, I'm going to have about a 12 to a 13 inch deep canoe in the middle. The shallowest part, if you would, a little bit deeper bow and stern. And yeah, that transformation, for me, it's the epitome of canoe building when I finally get down to driving those ribs in, and also the scariest part, because you don't want to blow out at that point. So you have to be pretty careful, and we'll be demonstrating that. I'm down to the finicky part now. I'm going to be working on the stem pieces, the front and the back of the canoe, bow and stern, and I have to take the rope off now because I don't want to have a bulge when I get fitting the bark against it. So what I've done is I've peeled a piece of inner bark off a cedar tree, and I'm going to wrap up my gunnel, so or my stem piece, I should say, because it'll keep the integrity, or the shape, if you would, of the bow and stern pieces.
This should keep you busy for a while.
Hey, that's going to do me for the whole day. Thank you very much. What I'm doing now is getting the bark trimmed off to
So
our...
you want to this clamp up
I need
higher?
that. I need it adjusted just slightly, but let me just get this guy roughly where we want it. It creaks and groans like my old bones. Okay, just give her a push in there a little bit. Yep, good. Now just lower it down so I got room to cut. That should do it. Good thing water's free when you're building a birch bark canoe. I have never worked with as thick a bark as this, so you can, this thing here is about better than 1/4 of an inch, and that's the kind of bark I'm dealing with, which is going to be a rugged canoe. But anyway, so I've got the far end stitched, and I'm working on this end now, stitching. So this stitch at the top is above water line, so it's not going to get pitched. From here down, I'm going to do a next stitching on following the gunnel line, following the stem line, and that's the part that'll get pitched because that'll be below water. Anyway, I'm going to have a look at the other end because to say I'm a little disappointed would be an understatement. And it all started when I laid the bark out. So when I rolled the bark out, I thought it was absolutely perfect, but I ended up having to cut about a 12-inch piece off, which shortened my canoe by 6 inches at either end. So that really high sweeping Algonquin end that I was going to end up with, it isn't going to happen. But so what I've ended up with at the other end, well, let's have a look. So I've been to the Canoe Museum in Peterborough numerous times, and anybody who's interested in bark canoes, it's a fascinating museum. They have hundreds, literally hundreds and hundreds of canoes. Most of them date late 1800s. That's at the point where birch bark canoes were going out of favor for canvas covered ones. So the Hudson Bay was changing their construction methods. And anyway, there's this beautiful collection there. But if one really makes a study of them, you'll see that a lot of them have repairs. And they're not always perfect. And well, I'm building one just like that. So yeah, because of my bark issues, I ended up having to make sort of a long nose Ojibwe. Well, maybe a short nose Ojibwe end on this end. It's going to look a little more Algonquin style at that end, but it's a little stubby, if you would, at both ends. But quite frankly, I don't care, because this darn thing is going to float, and got a lot of hours in. The alternative I had was to literally cut the bark off back here at both ends, undo all my stitching, cut off the bark, find more bark, and put an extension on either end, which would have been doable, but I've got a lot of fish to fry these days, and we're trying to get our food production going for the winter, so we got gardening. I really want to get at my blacksmith shop, which I'm going to build another log cabin for. So anyway, it's going to be what it is, but I think it's still going to be a very stout canoe given the thickness of the bark.